Hey, welcome to the Lead Out Loud podcast. I am Professor G, also known as Sean Genovese, and this is Real Leadership, a new segment, version, series of episodes. I don't know what we're going to call it, but that's REEL, Real Leadership, where we are going to talk about leadership through the lens of movies, TV shows, characters of that type. And today I have with me a character named Brian Leahy.
Sure.
He's been on the show before. Some of you may recognize him. Welcome, Brian. Welcome back.
Thank you. By the way, fantastic dad joke work on the puns and the lens. I mean, it's awesome. Real leadership. It's what it's all about.
You like that?
I love it. Yeah.
It of course, totally intentional. I don't just normally talk like that.
All good. Happy to be here. I'm really looking forward to talking, obviously, about movie clips and just the use of them. It's just such a great way to have discussions about work, about leadership, about real life, believe it or not, REAL. And so Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So this is intended to be a kickoff for, again, what I am calling real leadership. And moving forward, we'll pick some different movies, TV shows, have a theme each episode. For the episodes of this podcast where we're doing this, we'll still have some traditional episodes where we're just interviewing some guests. But today we're kicking off Real Leadership. We're going to start it off with something that's a little perhaps untraditional. And it's not a movie, is why I'm saying that. It's a portion or a clip from an episode of a TV show that I have used in the past many times in teaching, but usually to teach concepts related to a production system, continuous flow, that sort of thing. But Brian and I were talking about this concept a couple of weeks ago, and we realized that there's some overlap here with leadership. So the clip in question is from a show called I Love Lucy. Many of you probably don't even know what that show is or was. In fact, I probably should have looked up the exact year that this episode... Do you happen to know what year this episode aired?
I do not. I know the series ran sort of in the mid-50s. But this may have been one of the earlier seasons, if I remember correctly. I actually have the whole disc set, so I should know better based on the fact of using it in the past. But I can't remember what specific year this one was from.
Well, look, we're gonna do this in real time with our AI friends. Let's see if Copilot can get me an answer on that in the time it takes me to explain that I'm using Copilot to get an answer.
Can I take a guess? And I'll say 1957 will be my guess.
So, I mean, you're close. The episode is actually called Job Switching.
Yeah. And
it aired on September 15th, 1952.
Oh, I was way off.
Ooh. So, I mean, you had the right decade. Let's see. This says it is one of the most iconic and beloved episodes of the series. I don't know if it's the most beloved, but it definitely is iconic. I show this, as I said, to students in my production and operations management class. These are graduate students. A lot of them are international. So very few people have ever seen the clip before, and they've almost never seen the show or even heard of the show. But man, I get chuckles and laughs. It's really timeless. And so for those of you that haven't seen it, we'll put a link to the clip. It's on YouTube. But I'm going to just describe for you what's happening, because this is a podcast and not everybody's going to be watching. So the scene in question is Lucy and Ethel, her friend, are working in some kind of a chocolate factory They're clearly this place makes chocolate. They're now in the packaging department, and so they've been separated, and now they're coming back together, and they've been sent to the packaging department, and they're kind of comparing notes on how their experience has been. And it's pretty obvious from their conversation that it hasn't been going well. They've pretty much gotten kicked out of every department that they've been working in, and so as they're kind of comparing notes, the supervisor comes in, and we find out that this is their last chance. That if they don't make it here, they're going to get fired. So their job is pretty simple. There's a conveyor belt. It's going to have chocolate on it, and the conveyor belt is going to bring the chocolates to them, and they just have to pick the chocolate up, wrap some paper on it, put it back on the conveyor, and they're told under no circumstances should they allow any chocolate to get past them into the next station that hasn't been wrapped. If that happens, they're in trouble. So they get started. The supervisor leaves the room. They're thinking, wow, this is pretty easy. And then they start to fall a little behind. And rather than speeding up or asking the person to stop or slow down, they just start pulling chocolates off the conveyor belt. At one point, the supervisor's coming back in, and Lucy piles the chocolates into her hat. She's throwing them in her mouth. She's throwing them down her apron. She puts the hat on. It's got all the chocolate in it, and they can't talk because they got mouthful of chocolate. Supervisor comes in and sees that there's no unwrapped chocolate. She says, "You guys are doing a great job." Yells for them to speed it up, which of course is the last thing that they need. So I use this clip to really demonstrate things like, hey, we don't want to hide defects because then we can't solve the problems. It's also a good lesson in continuous flow and the idea that something happening upstream is going to affect things that are happening downstream. But let's put the leadership glasses on, Brian. So what's your key takeaway, now that I've set the stage for everybody? What's your key leadership takeaway from that scene?
So many, and good setup, by the way. One other thing I'll add to the setup, which I know you talk about, and we also talk about on the leadership side. They're in the room and they are literally walled off, so they cannot see what's happening on either end of that conveyor belt, which I know you talk about, and we talk about it too. I think the main piece that we would focus on first, Sean, was probably sort of the number one, management by fear, but also management by absence. In other words, the supervisor comes in, sort of gives them the gruff instructions as you described, wrap it, put it back on the belt. Any mistakes, you're fired. But what's really fascinating is doesn't give them any example of how to, doesn't stay put and watch to see how they're doing, literally leaves the room, closes the door. They're on their own. And so one of the things we used to talk a lot about was, that approach from that manager, unfortunately, is not uncommon. But think about the implications and the consequences of that, what I'll call management by absence, combined with then this fear factor that she's created setting up the task.
I don't know that the manager is ever given a name in the episode, so we'll just keep calling her the manager.
Yeah.
Is she a Theory X manager?
I don't know. Maybe. Um, she's clearly a manager who has an idea in her mind of what the finished product is supposed to look like. Um, but it was just really fascinating to watch her interact or not interact, actually. So she, you know, there's probably a lot of labels we could throw on her. Theory X could be one of them.
Well, I mean, I always describe Theory X to students as the assumption that people don't want to work and they won't work unless they're being watched
Yeah.
and there's consequences. She's almost apathetic, though. I mean, she says things like, hey, you're going to be fired if you don't do this right. But to your point, she doesn't stick around to monitor them or to tell them
No.
exactly what to do and how to do it as it continues to go. She just kind of walks away like she's got better things to do.
Yeah. Which, I mean, obviously, you and I can deconstruct the fact that this scene is over the top. It's fiction. It's made for television.
Is it?
Well, but let me give you a little hint. So when you and I started talking about this particular scene, and as you know, we used to make use of this scene in a middle management year-long cohort program when I was at MasterCard. It was a great way to open the program. Kid you not, we would get 45 minutes of debrief out of this clip just by itself at the beginning of our program with these mid-level managers, and layer upon layer upon layer of not only reaction or analysis, but also maybe this is closer to reality. And think about those two workers, how they feel. I think a lot of people could certainly see through their eyes once they see this clip, which I think is why not only the studio audience is really yucking it up, but to your point, even people who don't know I Love Lucy, you watch the scene and you're like, oh my gosh, this is hilarious because maybe this is closer to reality than we want to admit.
I mean, that's amazing because I'm just verifying that I didn't use the wrong number. It's a 3 minute clip.
Yeah.
It's three minutes of what's I guess probably 20 minutes of a television episode. Honestly, I couldn't even tell you what happens in the rest of the episode because this is the part that I remember and that I keep coming back to and that I think has become so timeless. But the idea that you can get 30, 45 minutes of debrief on a 3 minute clip from a show that aired in September of 1952 is amazing.
Yeah. And to your point, it's not only reflective of the timelessness of what they did, um, but sadly, from a work perspective and a leadership perspective, we're talking 50, 60, 70 years on now. Not much has changed for some people, not for all, but for some, they could look at this clip today and find that same level of empathy with Lucy, with Ethel, based on their own experiences in particular jobs. You and I have seen it. We've heard enough stories. We've had enough conversations with people along the way to know that unfortunately there are some echoes still of what's happening in that clip today and how people experience work.
So let's dive a little deeper into what's happening. This is going to be a slightly different episode compared to what I'm planning for these future real leadership episodes. Just because this is not a we're not talking about an entire movie. It's not as well known. I mean, we're talking about a 3 minute stretch of television here. But let's go a little bit deeper. So, what would you do differently if you were the manager in this chocolate factory?
Yeah. Well, let me back up and let's have a stop in a place of real humility. I know in my own history that I've done versions of what this manager has done. Maybe not as blatantly, maybe not as old school, but certainly I've run into some of the same mistakes and I've made those myself in terms of making assumptions, to your point, about the work being done, about people's ability or their interest in doing the work, not paying attention. So I think for me, there's a couple basic things. And one of them actually relates to what you like to talk about when you use this clip in class, but it also gets back to leadership. It sounds really cheesy to say it, but the walls need to come down on both sides of this conveyor belt, number one. Number two, as a leader, I think the biggest change could be how you show up, how you are present in the moment, explaining or even demonstrating a couple different ways that they might be able to wrap the chocolates so that they can keep pace. Um, but then also not being in the space of abandonment. I think that's the biggest thing is this is a clip for me where sometimes you need a leader who's willing to hang in there with you. It doesn't mean micromanagement. It doesn't mean they do the work for you. But my goodness, if a manager's not willing to hang in there and understand what you're going through, right? Kind of back to empathy and connection. It's the biggest miss for me in this clip. And so, if we were going to coach that manager to make some changes, I would definitely take the walls down, but I would say you got to be there with them. You got to help them initially and see how they do. and then coach them. Let's not forget, by the way, I'm going to go back to when you were setting up the clip and describing the clip. You accurately said it because I have it in my notes. This was their fourth department. It was essentially what a lot of us have come to know as pass the trash.
Yeah.
That in and of itself
They couldn't
is,
handle it elsewhere, so we're going
uh,
to move you over here.
yeah, and that's a fundamental issue too, because now we've got other managers who are probably doing the similar thing. And oh, by the way, not even talking to each other. So why don't we just send them over to the assembly line, right? Let's send them over to packaging because, they can't hack it here. So I would say 4 times we've had leadership abandonment in many ways that probably could have changed how they experienced this particular factory.
That's a really great observation, and it now I'm having some throwbacks to that. That happened to me. I was the recipient of. I've been the recipient of that probably multiple times, but there's one time in particular where um, I I hired somebody internally at Lockheed Martin. This was an internal candidate, which
Mm-hmm.
is way different than getting somebody from the outside. Like, you're rolling the dice a little bit on any external hire, but there's a certain amount of trust and a certain understanding that is supposed to exist
Yeah.
with an internal candidate. Anyway, I interviewed this guy. Ultimately, I contacted the manager, as was typical, and they said, "Yeah, sure, this would be great." Fast forward, the candidate is not a good fit for our team, not very motivated, doesn't really like the job that he's come in to do. And then I find out from that releasing manager that he was trying to get rid of him. Basically, he was going to put him on a performance plan if he had stayed in the group. Now, I mean, I was so mad, but I mean, that's kind of what's going on here.
Yeah.
They're one step away from getting fired, and so instead of trying to get them some help in the other departments, hey, maybe this isn't well suited for you, or hey, we're going to get you somebody to come and show you how to do this a little bit better. They just go, hey, we're going to put you over into the packaging department.
Yeah. And then to your point that you probably make within your in your course when you use it, a horrible process, right? A terrible design of work. I mean, it's a confluence of all the wrong factors. It's a perfect storm of all the wrong factors coming together, which again, I do think back to your point, some of that plays into why this is such a classic timeless clip. I mean, for the people watching, who are maybe close to our vintage, all you have to do is say the Lucy Chocolate Factory clip. Many people know it. They at least know the premise of it. They've seen it once or twice. And like most people, they find it funny, but also funny based on, kind of the truth meter there is really, really strong.
I'm going to go back to something else you said too about, hey, you got to tear down the walls.
Yeah.
One thing that I would do differently if I was this manager, she did not even try really to convey intent. So you've got now Lucy and Ethel are at this one point of a process. There's behind a wall, literally behind a wall, with just a little hole for a conveyor to come through, is the upstream process. Something else is happening
Yeah.
up there. It's coming to them, and all they're really told is that you have to do this. You have to wrap the chocolates before they go out that door. Not, hey, you've got to do this because here's what happens over there.
Yeah.
Here's why it's important. Here's what happens if you let one through. Here's what's the process. Here's the cost. There's none of that. And I when I do show this to students, I kind of make it up. I just go, yeah, the next stage, they're going to put the wrapped chocolates into a box. I don't know.
You're making it up.
I'm making it up. But why didn't the manager explain that?
Yeah.
So that now they understand, oh, this is why it's important to do this part of the process.
Yeah. It's a great call out because let's back up. You know, okay, maybe you can't tear down the wall. So let's just say, for sake of argument, not possible.
They're made
To
from
your
asbestos, and we just can't
right
touch
for
them.
all the is the 1950s, right?
It is.
Um, but to your point you just made, I'll take it back to leadership. A good strong leader would literally walk them into the other room to show them the first part, walk them back through their section and remind them of what they're supposed to do. And then, to your point, walk them to the end, the third portion of this three-part work stream, and show them what's going on, or maybe introduce them to the people there, whatever you need to do. So, again, for me, a lot of this, while it is about work design and process, I will still say a good leader can even help mitigate what might not be a great, well designed piece of work. And she didn't do that, obviously, which thank goodness for all of our humor that she didn't. It's what makes the clip the clip. But so many lessons from a leadership perspective that are sitting in this, to your point, 3 minutes.
I
It's
have to
amazing.
assume that um, the writers, maybe I shouldn't assume, but I do. I'm assuming that, the writers, when they wrote this episode and this scene in particular, they were writing it with the intention of making Lucy the butt of the joke, as is really what the show's about. I mean, that's
Right.
that's that's pretty much every episode is her getting into some kind of anecdote or trouble, and she is, the buffoon or the bumbling
Hmm.
whatever. But boy, the more we really think about this, this is really, it's the manager. She's such a horrible manager. And here's another piece of evidence, because the only interaction that we really see her have with anybody else in this fictional factory is when she tells them what to do, and then she shouts, "Let her roll,"
Yep.
and nothing happens. And she shouts again, "Let her roll," and nothing happens. And then what does
Yeah.
she say? "Someone must be asleep at the switch." And she marches off into the other room, presumably to go yell at somebody who
Yeah.
was so motivated to do their job that they weren't paying attention for their cue.
Yeah. Or they've learned how to drown out her, let her roll. Yeah. It's so funny. You and I took similar notes in the sense of I laughed when I saw that part and I made a note about it. Like, it's somebody else's fault, right? To your point, you said it exactly as she said it. Someone must be asleep at the switch.
Yep.
How about, oh, maybe I didn't explain myself well enough. And I need to go clarify what I meant. That's not going to happen in this particular clip. So yeah, it's really interesting too, to your point. Like Lucy, I mean, the show is centered on her. And you could almost imagine, I mean, this is unrelated to leadership or the work process. I would be willing to bet the back half of this clip was her improvising what to do with the chocolates, right?
Oh,
Because I
yeah.
think I'm sure that was part of the fun of it, right? To your point, in the hat, down the
Throwing them in her
apron, right?
mouth.
Yeah, eating
Yep.
them, spitting them out. I mean, it's that's probably her genius at work. I'm sure they didn't quite write it that way. Um, but I think what's really interesting about that, so let's take this back to the topic at hand. Think about again, the leader comes back in, and I'll describe it a little bit in more detail than you did. So the leader is looking at their backs as they're facing the conveyor belt. She doesn't walk around to the front.
Right.
She doesn't check the sides. All she sees, to your point, are their backs with an empty conveyor belt, not realizing that most of the chocolates are sitting inside their outfits or in their hat. And so again, the opportunity for the leader to do something really, really well, and she blows it, right? I mean, she just completely misses it. And to your point, maybe it's apathy, maybe it's who cares, or I expect that they would have done this, the right way. So I'm just gonna speed it up.
I'm known around here in my house for saying, to that rhetorical question of why would they do that, it was in the script. But the funny thing is, it's, you write the script, and let's assume that the focus was on Lucy, and the rest of this is just a backdrop to be able to
Yeah.
go make the jokes that they need to make. And of course, what do they choose? What's the easiest thing to choose as that backdrop? Well, let's just go with kind of what we know about how a factory operates.
Yep.
and they've captured the dysfunction of how a factory operates like beautifully.
Yeah. Well, and that's what was always so amazing about when we would do this clip and then do the debrief. And again, we're talking about relatively high level professional, right? Mid to senior level managers. And invariably, somebody in the room would say it and everybody would laugh and agree, like, oh my gosh, that's how I feel some days. I feel like Lucy and Ethel some days. And while that was funny to hear it in the room, it, like as I digested it, I was like, oh my goodness, like holy cow. People are really feeling the stress and the pressure, whatever organization they're in, that sort of translated into a way that they could connect with Lucy and Ethel. That took me by surprise in a big way.
So, if I'm getting that correctly, what they're really saying then is, yeah, man, what if Lucy and Ethel were trying their best, and this was the best that they could do, and the system and the institution that they're in just failed them and left them
Yeah,
hanging out to dry,
yeah,
and how frustrating that is from that other perspective. I actually hadn't thought about that.
yeah. It's a powerful call out because it also shows, regardless of the type of work that you're doing, there are days, and maybe more than just days, maybe it's weeks, months, years, where people feel like they can't keep up with a conveyor belt, whatever the conveyor belt is. And to your point, in a good environment, people like a leader, people like your coworkers, they're there to help that conveyor belt feeling, right, not be overwhelming. And so many times that's missed. So that was also a big eye opener for me. It's like, wow, we had a lot of smart people in our room because they were translating what is obviously, to your point, a very factory, right, tactile piece of work to their own work, which wasn't like that. But they sure felt the conveyor belt dynamic during the course of their time there.
So I'm going to deliberately keep this episode a little bit shorter,
Sure.
as Lucy used to do, by the way. So it's very apropos that we're using this as the first in the series of real leadership, because a lot of people don't realize that back, I think it was a little after Lucy, maybe late 50s, early 60s, she did a podcast. Obviously, it wasn't called a podcast, but the structure was pretty much very similar. She would take a tape recorder and go visit her friends in Hollywood, and she would do an interview with them. And it was bite sized, which is what we try to do with this show. So it'd be about a 15-minute conversation. And then if the conversation was continuing, like if there was more to be had, she'd say, hey, can we do this again tomorrow? And they'd cut another 15-minute
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
a segment of that. That was just a fun fact leading up to this final question. So, is there anything that they didn't get right in this clip from your perspective? Or to say it another way, what's the most unrealistic leadership moment in this scenario, if there is one?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it earlier. Unrealistic, I think that's debatable, but it's clearly in this
Unfortunately.
particular clip fictionalized, which is when she does when the manager comes back in after the dust has settled, conveyor belt has stopped, and we know that they're covering up for all the missed wrapped chocolates. The fact that she doesn't pick up on that for
Yeah.
me, right? I mean, that's a stretch, right? I mean, look, I was radio, TV, film in college. You talk about willing suspension of disbelief. There's a lot of that we have to endure, and it's part of the fun of it. That, for me, from a leadership perspective, is probably the biggest stretch. Having said that, you and I could probably think back on our own experiences or the people that we worked with. It might not be as much of a stretch as what I assume. But for me, that's kind of that piece that you go, oh, come on. You have to see that, right? They're not getting this right. But maybe not. Maybe not.
I mean, I guess if I kind of expand it a little bit, I've done it. I've done that before where I make certain assumptions about somebody's capabilities or their understanding of what the assignment is.
Yeah.
And you know, days or maybe even I can think of one example where weeks went by and hey, okay, now it's time to really see what you got, and you realize, uh-oh, we've got to disconnect.
Yeah.
But there was that moment where okay, we're able to do some checking. We don't really know how, at least just from this clip, how they're discovered because it kind of ends with them just totally losing
Struggling to keep up.
control.
Yeah. Yeah. You can assume that at some point somebody in the other room is going to come in and say, none of these chocolates are wrapped.
Yeah,
What's going on?
yeah. Well, and that's probably, I guess, maybe that's what I would choose as the unrealistic part. So really, nobody downstream. Where was the person downstream that was yelling up to say, "Hold it up a minute"?
Yeah.
You know, or coming in, even if they're not concerned about process or leadership, just coming in going, "Hey, you're killing me here. What are you doing, letting this stuff come through? You can't do that."
Yeah. Yeah. And yet you and I know, again, based on studying it enough or even working in organizations where there still was a bit of an assembly line process, um, you could see where some of that stuff gets overlooked, or people are so hyper focused on this is my slice of the pie, and I got to do my slice of the pie, and you know what? That stuff coming through, that's waste. So we're just going to have to write that off as waste. But yeah, I get what you're saying. You would have think somebody would be screaming from the other room, going, "What's going on? What's the
Yeah,
deal?"
because there's obviously other people in the factory,
Yeah,
and they have responsibilities too. And now, yeah, their lack of success has to be impacting those other folks, and nobody says anything. Why didn't
no.
they say anything? Because it was in the script.
Well, I will say, I mean, as you pointed out, and you and I have talked about this, like this is such a phenomenal clip to even use, number one, but also use in the spirit of what you're going to be doing in the series, right? Where we can really leverage great pieces of art, movies, clips to emphasize some really important lessons from the world of work. But let's not also, I mean, your timing is great, right? Valentine's Day is in a week-ish. We've got the chocolate factory. I mean, there's a lot of synergy here, Sean. Well done. I like it.
All right. So, Brian, since you are the only guest host today, I'm going to let you choose what we do next. And if you got, I know you had some things. We talked through a few options, so I know you've got some ideas. I'll let you announce it here live for everybody to build anticipation if you'd like. What should we do next?
Ah, I think for me, one of the movies that has a lot of potential for leveraging clips. So there's two of them. So I'm gonna throw both of them out here, Sean.
Okay.
I love Apollo 13 from a leadership and a work perspective. I also love the movie Big with Tom Hanks. There's a lot of good stuff that's hidden in there from a leadership perspective and a work perspective. It's not what the movie's about, but his time as he's working in the toy company, there's gold in them there hills
Okay.
around some of those clips.
This is even better. This is even better because now I'm going to leave it as a bit of a cliffhanger here.
All right.
So, on the next episode of the Lead Out Loud podcast, Real Leadership Edition, we will be discussing either Apollo 13 or Big. I have already made the decision, so I know which one it's
Nice.
going to be.
Yes.
And the rest of you are going to have to wait to find out. So thank you for listening or watching. A quick shameless plug. If you like this kind of discussion, if you like these topics, if you have a team that you want to kind of take to the next level so that you're not Lucy in the Chocolate Factory or the manager from Lucy in the Chocolate Factory, head over to lolworkshop.com. I do those sorts of things. And in the meantime, you can keep listening to our anecdotes and ramblings and all that other stuff. So, Brian, thank you for joining me for this inaugural Real Leadership edition.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I am Professor G, and we'll see you all next time.